Good afternoon. How are you all? Today's regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee, which I'll call to order now. I'm John Quincy, Chair of the committee, joined by Council Members Yang, Bender, and Johnson. And we are a quorum of the committee, so we can continue and do our work. There's a number of items on our rather brief agenda. It's actually 22 items, all on our consent agenda. The first item being 2 legal settlements. Then from the City Coordinator's Office, we have the City of Minneapolis Charitable Campaign Program. And from the Communications Department, there's the acceptance of donation of billboard time and broadcast time from Clear Channel and Comcast Cable. The Convention Center continues its work with the Target Center renovation. The Finance and Property Services Department is bringing forward 3 items: the American with Disabilities Facility Compliance Surveys, a Dakota County Technical College internship, acceptance of a gift of a 3-week internship from Dakota County Technical College, and Nicollet Mall reconstruction, authorizing the release of RFPs for financing options for Nicollet Mall reconstruction. The IT department brings forward 3 items. One is on the Advanced Public Safety program and information technology terms and conditions, and authorizing to insert additional IT specific terms and conditions into future RFPs at IT's discretion, and work with the City Attorney's Office to amend those T&Cs from time to time as necessary. And the final item from IT is the managed services contract, increasing Unisys Corporation managed services contract by $1 million. The Executive Committee is bringing forward the labor negotiation tentative agreement with the fire chiefs, and approving a tentative agreement with Emergency Communications Supervisors Unit represented by the Teamsters. Let's see, the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee is bringing forward 2 items. One is the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development Redevelopment Grant Program applications, and then environmental remediation grants, a series of those awarded from DEED as well. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee is bringing forward a transportation engagement efforts revolving around Hennepin County's second 7.5% neighborhood revitalization program funds, and the Minnesota State Environmental Grant applications, just authorizing execution of grant agreements with MPCA related to applications for the Environmental Assistance Grant Program. And Public Safety and Civil Rights and Emergency Management Committees bringing forward 2 items. The Minneapolis Public Housing Authorities authorizing a contract in the amount of $108,825 to support a sergeant investigator for 1 year in relation to MPHA Housing Choice Program. And of course, authorizing the contract with ECHO in the amount of $54,750 in support of the If You See Something, Say Something public awareness campaign. Transportation and Public Works is bringing forward 4 items, all related to bids and the Cedar Avenue Sidewalk Modification Project, and disposal and hauling of excavation spoils, and the 45th Avenue North and Irving Avenue North alley construction projects. Are there any questions or comments from committee members on those 22 items? Seeing none, I'll move all 22 items for approval. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. They all magnificently pass unanimously. So, which gets us to our exciting part of the day, as Sandy Christensen is able to take us through a presentation on services for internal service fees and internal service funds, and a continuing saga of what's our budget like this year. We've got to come up with a snappy name for that.
I will endeavor for a snappy title. In lieu of a snappy title, I'll introduce today's topic. As you mentioned, Chair Quincy, are in our ongoing overview of various factors that impact the city's budgeting process. Today, I'm here to talk to you about generally the city's charges for services and fees, and specifically the internal service fund charges that are used to allocate costs internally within the organization. Definition of charges for services and fees, they sound very similar. There's some slight nuances that differentiate the two. Charges for service are generally linked to an exchange transaction for which there is an immediate or direct provision of service. For example, if a customer were to come in and purchase GIS data, that would be classified as a charge for service. Typically, a fee is a charge associated with a reimbursement of cost of a previously provided service or of an anticipated service. And we'll generally see those when we look at business licensing fees or for fees associated with the issuance of a permit for which there will be additional work provided by city staff in terms of inspections and so on. Both of these fees are calculated on a full cost basis. We may not charge more than the full cost of the provision of these services. However, policymakers within the organization may choose to charge less. There are also some statutory requirements that limit the amount that the city may charge for some of these activities. They pertain generally to activities that we charge to external customers. So when I speak of on a full cost basis actually incorporates several different types of costs that we allocate to a specific activity. Direct costs are those that can be directly, as the name implies, can be directly related to a specific service. For example, if we look at a building inspector going out to perform an inspection, the salaries and wages of that individual will be considered a direct cost. If we have our water department installing a water meter at your residence, the cost of that water meter is a direct cost associated with that service. The more nebulous costs that can be sometimes difficult to explain are what we call indirect costs, and those are costs or expenses that cannot typically be specifically associated or directly aligned with the provision of an individual service, but are spread out across a wide variety of activities depending on the utilization of that activity of the support service. An example of an indirect cost would be a departmental administration cost or building depreciation. Supplies within a department would also qualify as an indirect cost. So for indirect costs, what is our basis for allocating or parsing out the cost for these support services across the individual direct service? Cost allocation is the basis that we use for determining how we allocate these costs to the direct function. It is the assignment of a common cost to the consumer of that function, which would mean if we're talking about the support function within an organization such as a finance or a payroll type of activity, an individual payroll action or entering of data and or the issuance of a subsequent check is a little bit difficult to quantify individually, as every participant in that organization is utilizing that service. So we need to come up with an allocation methodology in order to appropriately spread those costs out over the direct services. Why do we do cost allocation? It helps us track all the costs associated with the ongoing operation more efficiently. And what is it? What is the cost allocation? It is really our means of identifying and properly assigning our costs, and helps with our long-term financial planning to determine whether or not we have appropriately provided funding for those support activities such as, again, finance, human resources, supervision, building costs, and other items that you would not normally see as a direct cost. So again, some examples. What you might see in an indirect cost within a department may be the cost of an individual employee's supervisor, their director, support staff, and materials and supplies. There's also the additional layer of organizational administration, and within the city of Minneapolis, you would see that in the provision of support through the city coordinator's office, the city clerk's office, or the mayor's office. And then there's also the cost of the facilities to support the employees, as well as the supplies and materials that they may need. So departments and functions within the city of Minneapolis that would qualify in that category would be our property services, which manages our building, the building rent cost and depreciation, fleet management services, finance and payroll function, human resources, information technology and software, as well as the city's various property liability and work comp insurances. So as I mentioned earlier, that's really the basis for how we use the city's costs to determine what an individual unit of service would be an appropriate charge to an individual utilizing that service. Within the city, we do have a cost allocation mechanism to parse out the support costs throughout the organization so that we have a better idea of what does it really take to run the enterprise. Not every department has their own payroll. They don't have their own information technology area. So it's important that we're able to utilize those larger departments and determine how much of that resource is being used on an individual basis. So this slide is, despite being rather busy, does lay out the internal service areas within the city of Minneapolis. The engineering materials and testing area is an area in which we track the goods and supplies used for the city's pavement program. The intergovernmental services area is the area in which we track the city's information technology provision, telephones, central mailing and printing. Property services, as I alluded to earlier, pertains specifically to the overall maintenance and rent of the city's facilities, except for the property, the City Hall, which is an owned facility of the Municipal Building Commission. We also have the Equipment Services Fund, more commonly referred to as the fleet area. We do manage our own fleet. The costs of managing the fleet are then allocated out to the individual user departments. That would also cover the depreciation of the equipment as well as the replacement. Public Works Stores is an area in which we manage an inventory of parts and materials that are used throughout the Public Works Department. We do maintain an inventory, and when those items are used, we do cost them out to the individual departments and the specific services. And finally, the city's self-insurance fund. As you're aware, the city is self-insured for work comp and liability. We do purchase policies for some of our larger properties, but what the self-insurance fund does is it allows us to maintain a certain amount of resources to cover our own internal work comp injuries as well as liability claims against the city. You've seen on the consent agenda earlier in this meeting that there were several claims. They would be funded through the city's self-insurance fund. And the benefit of maintaining our own self-insurance fund is that we are able to smooth our own basic claims history rather than providing for the administration by a third-party administrator. One other area within the city that is not specifically categorized as an internal service fund, but is very important in determining the overall cost of providing services in the city, is the general fund overhead or the provision of services by departments that are funded in the general fund. So again, many of the city's support functions are housed in departments that are funded through the general fund in large part. Many of our regular non-specific revenues as well as property taxes. And those functions include the city's, in large part, finance department, the coordinator, human resources, the city's 311 function, the clerk's office, civil rights, and intergovernmental relations. On an annual basis, the city goes through and provides a calculation to parse out the associated costs of these support mechanisms to the other departments. They may also be allocating these costs to other support departments. So sometimes it gets to be a little intertwined when human resources is providing functions to finance and property services, who is then providing further services to other direct service departments.
Would that mean that in some way we might be double paying ourselves?
We're not double paying ourselves, Chair Quincy. We do go through the exercise for the departments within the general fund merely for the purpose of determining what it takes to support that function. We can also use the information we derive from going through that exercise when we're determining the fees that we charge to outside entities For example, if we, when we look at our annual licensing, business licensing fee schedule, or in the event that we were to receive payment for overtime incurred by the police department when they're providing supplemental security for some activity downtown. So we don't charge it to ourselves, but if in the event that we are performing a service to an outside entity, we would utilize that information to fully cost the activity.
And while I have your quick attention, on the part where it says annual calculation performed, where is that done in terms of a budget process? Is it before the budget, during the budget, after the budget?
The mechanism of performing the cost allocations is really one of the first steps that happens in the annual budgeting process, because they're what we would call a non-discretionary or largely non-discretionary cost. In order to determine the current level of services or to maintain the same level of services, we go through the exercise of looking at what does it take to really maintain the city's base function and provide for funding for that. Those services is really one of the first steps that we look at when we're determining what it takes to fund the city's budget.
And where does that appear in a department budget?
Within a department budget, there are several different line items. You would likely not see it in your in the budget book that the city posts online, but in an individual departmental budget, there are about 3 different types of activities that you would see. An information technology charge is reflected for those services provided by the Intergovernmental Services Fund. You would also see the work comp premium and liability premiums that are charged out to the individual departments by the self-insurance fund, and similarly for property services rent, as well as for costs associated with vehicles and fuel and maintenance on the vehicles.
Okay. Any other comments while we have them on that slide? Okay. Please.
Okay, and again, just reiterating that the general fund charges are not charged out per se to the other general fund departments. It's mainly for an activity-based costing exercise. However, because there are several other activities within the city that are funded through non-property taxes and other revenue sources, those activities do reimburse the general fund for the functions that happen in the general fund. For example, the enterprise funds or the utilities are self-supporting business units in large part, so the information technology services that are provided to the water fund, for example, the water fund will fund that. The cost of providing payroll services to the water fund is reimbursed by the water fund and through the rates paid by the consumers of the city's water. And again, we use it mainly for determining full cost. So a little bit of history about the city's internal service funds. Many of the charges and budgets through the years were determined by service level agreements or agreements between the service provider and the customer departments as to what level of service do we want you to provide for us this year, and the corollary, the promise from the internal service provider that they would do X level of service provision and or so many units of service. And what this did is it allowed flexibility to the departments to purchase the services they wanted from the service provider. However, because there was the opportunity for the department to basically buy as much service as they wanted, of course, if they didn't want much service, then the internal service provider received less revenue, which in turn provided for higher per unit charges because the overall cost of that service usually didn't waver a lot. So it led to a higher cost per service, which would then lead to departments wanting less service because the cost was higher. So it could be a self-perpetuating issue. And again, during times of financial duress, the departments occasionally opted out of the service when they had challenges and when they were required to make decisions between other operational expenses versus internal service charges. And the ability to have discretion in terms of the allocation of the costs out to the customer departments led to significant deficits in the internal service funds in past years. When those costs were not fully allocated over a number of years, it led to a net asset deficit in the internal service funds of about $62 million, and that was in about the year 2000. However, when the organization recognized these challenges, they put in place a workout plan, which in large part involved transfers from the general fund to the internal service funds to bring them back into a positive position and to allow for them to grow and maintain the appropriate amount of fund balances so that they could cover any contingencies that they might have. And again, the original workout plan was supposed to go through the year 2019. However, due to steps taken along the way and positive performance within those areas, we were able to budget 2014 as the last year of the transfer to cover those deficits. So they're in a very good shape now, and that allows us some more flexibility in the future.
Right. Thank you.
And just a little graph to show the workout plan and the elimination of the need to transfer funds in. You'll see that beginning in 2001, and when warranted and when available, there would be transfers from the general fund when the general fund had met its already existing obligations for minimum fund balances and other costs. And we're very happy to see it drop down to next to nothing in 2015. So that's good news.
Yeah, that was always one line item on a budget that I never understood, transfers.
Transfers, right. And
What do we get for that?
We'll talk about the transfers and why the new model and methodology for dealing with internal service funds is really much more transparent and visible to both the council and the customer department. So what changed? So changes in the funding methodology now support long-term financial stability in the internal service funds. Beginning in the 2014 budget, departments were not required to balance their budget with internal service charges calculated within their base budget. So in layman's terms, what that means is we told them, don't worry about your internal service charges. You worry about the areas of your budget that you have the control over, your materials and supplies and other activities, and the organization will worry about taking care of the support costs through the internal service mechanism. So we adopted full allocation principles. We didn't allow departments to say, nah, we don't really want to have that. You get it whether you want it, but we'll tell you how to pay for it. We'll give you appropriation to pay for it, so don't worry about it. The departments were provided with the necessary budget appropriation to fund these charges, and the internal service levels were then determined at the aggregate. We can look at overall, what does it take to run an IT department? We don't have to be looking at what each individual department is saying, well, I don't want to have a new PC this year. We look at what it takes organizationally for us to provide the best service that we can for the dollars that are available. And going back to a previous question, Chair Quincy, the cost for the internal service charges are one of the first items that are taken into consideration in the annual budget process. We consider that about the time that we're looking at any factors for salary and benefit changes due to existing contracts and so on. So it is one of the first items we consider. And again, the new methodology for allocating internal services really does provide for and requires transparency in terms of ongoing and long-term costs of the city's operations. We have to fund depreciation. We see what it costs to replace the items that we need to maintain our business. We see equipment replacements, particularly when we deal with the information technology area as well as the city's fleet. Software maintenance and contractual obligations, particularly those costs associated with multi-year agreements in which there's an inflation factor that once we buy into that contractual agreement is an obligation that we need to take care of right away. So if we sign an agreement with a software provider and the 5-year agreement provides for a 3% annual increase, that's kind of the first thing that comes off at the top of the list. So that's in large part why we do consider it part of the internal service charges. And this chart, I think, will go to the point of more transparency versus covering deficits in the internal service funds merely through the transfer of resources. The bottom line that you see on the chart before you shows the transfers that were made as part of that workout plan to resolve deficits in the internal service funds. At the same time, we recognize that a full allocation methodology will really offset any need to just do lump sum transfers in order to solve deficits. So you see the blue line that continues moving up actually shows how we've implemented full allocation of the costs needed to fund those internal services, and at the same time, the need for us to transfer over lump sums to maintain financial stability have been eliminated. So you'll see those costs allocated throughout the budget within the individual departments when they bring their presentations to you later this fall. So in conclusion, with the internal service funds, for the future, we would look to continue fully allocating the costs so that we can represent to the council as well as the residents the full cost of provision of service, as well as we're refining our fund balance policies to make sure that we're retaining a sufficient amount of money in those individual funds to cover contingencies, but probably no more than we need to make sure that we're appropriately charging out to the individual user departments. And we'll be monitoring the growth and recalibrating those internal service charges as needed to, again, maintain those appropriate balances.
Okay.
So, any questions? I'm happy to answer them.
Good. Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Chair Quincy. So this is actually a question related to external services.
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask about this, though, with the charges for services and fees. I'm sure it's very similar externally that we look at the total cost and indirect costs as well, and then factor that into fees. I know that's been a topic with certainly the home teardowns over in Southwest Minneapolis as well. Just thinking ahead to budget season, when a department comes forward and let's say the health department wants 5 new health inspectors and they say that's going to cost $200,000, do we know, or are we taking into account at that time that that would be reimbursed by a fee, and then that wouldn't be factored into questions about raising property taxes or things like that?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Johnson, I give you multiple answers to that same question. The decision to fund a particular activity or for the city to choose to do a specific activity is typically not made on the premise of whether we can charge for it. The activity is something that's more policy driven. We can then determine what the full cost of providing that activity is, and then the council may choose to charge for it. We, again, don't, the activity comes first and the ability to charge for it comes afterwards. So they aren't necessarily decisions that will be made at the same time. That said, however, often when there is a policy discussion about the city implementing a new activity or expanding an existing activity, if we want to move forward with a charge associated with it, the individual departments are typically working very closely with me and my department in the budget area to determine the appropriate amount and whether or not they should be making any linkage between the two. Again, the activity comes first and the revenue may or may not come later depending on subsequent policy decisions.
Great, thank you. That answers my question.
Okay. And for further note, I do intend on coming back at your next meeting to provide additional information using this presentation as a segue into a discussion about charges to external customers.
Is that another way of saying
Next time,
next time a report on fees and permits?
yes.
Thank you. Good. Well, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Be great. Thank you very much. It is, this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, that's the 7th of an exciting presentation. We've covered debt obligation, city revenue, property taxes, expenditures, the budget process, and then the capital budget process. And what's coming next is license permits report.
Yes,
And
followed by tax increment financing.
tax increment financing, all follow-up questions from this committee. So thank you for that. It's a great presentation. I'm sure it'll be added to the website, which is available for everybody to view in the Finance Department under annual budget process is the tag. With that, I think I'd like to move to receive and file this report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and that is done. And so is our agenda, so we stand adjourned. Thank you very much.